Woo-wee! Have we got an episode for you today? Welcome back. My name is Michael. Today's the day. Yes, it is. Today is the day. Today's the day I built my first FPV drone for cinematic flying and crispy, juicy, succulent. Well, all that footage that you and I both want to get. So this is learning to FPV with me. Great. So the purpose of this episode is basically just to document my whole process of building a drone. I ordered all of the parts. You can see the video of me unboxing all those parts up here somewhere. And today's video is going to be just about putting all those pieces together into an actual FPV racing drone that looks something like this. Well, actually, it looks exactly like this. This is the one that I built. Right, so some clarifications before we begin. And I wrote a list. This is the first time I have ever done this. So be gentle in the comments. 2, I had my MacBook open with YouTube and I was basically watching various different videos for the different sections of building this drone. It went relatively smoothly. Aside from a couple things, I was missing a few parts which I didn't know I needed. And some of the parts that I did have were the incorrect sizes, so I needed to order those parts separate. The build took me, I would say, about 6 hours over a number of days with 2 early morning sessions to get those parts into the drone. Another important thing to note, I am not an expert solderer or solderer, however you say it in your country of residence. This is purely a documentation of my process for building a drone. This is not supposed to be a how-to guide. If you're looking for a detailed how-to guide from an expert, I suggest you go watch an expert. But if you're looking for a beginner's way of explaining how I put a drone together that flies and works and everything checks out, this might just be the video for you. And this is the order we're going to go. We're going to assemble the frame, we're going to put on the motors, we are going to put on the ESC, we're going to put on the flight controller, we are going to put on the DJI air unit, we're going to clip on the top plate, we're going to put on a battery strap, we're going to put on the battery, we're going to do our smoke test, and then hopefully 100% worked. It works. I don't know, you'll have to wait and see. Right, before you start, you want to make sure you have all the correct tools. Now, get all your tools, lay it out on the table. You'll need a bunch of different drivers. You'll need pliers, clippers, a ruler is something that I would suggest. You'll need some electrical tape, perhaps cable ties, a pair of scissors maybe, and then a pen and paper I would suggest to have handy to note down some of the things that you're learning along the way. Great, so the first thing you're going to want to do is get your frame out the box, get all the pieces laid out, and open up that instruction manual, because that instruction manual is going to tell you exactly which types of screws you need to use, which plates go where, which arm pieces go where, and that's super important. A great way of figuring out which screws are which is to have a ruler handy. That way you can measure each of the screws and figure out which one is which. That's something that I really struggled with. So have a ruler handy. A ruler will come in very, very clutch when you need to know which screws are which. So what you want to do is you want to take the screws and connect up the legs to the bottom plate and screw them up. There are 2 sets of screws that goes into each arm. One of them is to hold the legs to the bottom plate, and the other one is to go straight up through to hold the standoffs, which we're going to screw on in a second. You'll see that there's 2 different types of standoffs in this particular iFlight Titan DC5 pack. Some are shorter, some are longer, and then you have two that go at the back that have these little thinner tops, which are so that you can put the antenna TPU mount to. Once your frame's all done, this will be the first time your kind of drone has come to life, and you can see the shape, the size, the weight of what you are embarking on. Now we have a frame which is ready to take our motors. I have 4 motors on this quadcopter. Makes sense. You want to get all the motors out of their little packets or boxes, and then you want to start putting them together. When you unpack the motors, it'll come with lots of different pieces. It'll come with little screws in different millimeter lengths. In my case, it came with 3mm screws and 4mm screws. My frame is a 5mm frame, so I knew as soon as I opened this that these screws weren't going to fit. It also comes with the top nut that goes on the top of the motor to screw the props down later when you come to screwing props on. Ensure that you have the correct screws. When you're screwing in your motors, you don't want to have anything sticking out the top of the motor mount. I'll install these motors with the 4mm screws because I didn't have enough in a longer length. So for now, these will do. This was just for the purpose of this video, so I could get the drone finished and complete. Now, this particular pack comes with TPU mounts that go onto each of the legs, each of the arms, and serves as protection in hits and bumps, and also from the ground where the drone is sitting on. Now, I didn't install these the first time around because I was unsure if I had the correct screws. My frame came with motor wire guards, which were double-sided tape to them, so I installed those on all 4 of my arms. 2 of them were too long, so I cut them down to size, installed them before I started to install the ESC or do any soldering. Now you will be in a position where you have 4 motors on with all of your wires pointing inwards, covered by the motor guards to a naked frame in the middle, ready for your ESC to be installed. Right, it's now time for the ESC installation, and the first thing you need to do is take it out of the box, grab these little things called gummies or rubber grommets, and install those into the 4 corners of the ESC controller. Those are kind of finicky and tricky to put on. What I would suggest is be patient. Don't use the thinnest driver that you have because that will puncture through your gummies, which is not good. So use something that's got a little bit more size to it and slowly push them in. So you got your gummies installed. The next thing you want to do is go get the stack screws. Not sure if they're called that. You want to go get the long screws that come with your ESC and start installing those in the frame. You either will have a 20mm by 20mm ESC, or you will have a 30mm by 30mm ESC, and depending on that, it'll be written on your flight controller or your whole flight stack pack that you buy. They put those on the inner or the outer holes in the center of your frame. It might be located elsewhere, but the same principle applies. You want to thread those through, thread the little nylon nuts. In my case, I got nylon nuts down on so that you have essentially 4 screws ESC to slide onto. Now it's time to solder or solder. Solder, whatever you call it. It's time to do the thing that you've probably been dreading, the thing that I was absolutely dreading. Now, you should probably stop at this point if you don't know how to solder. So pause the video, go figure out how to solder, and then come back to this point. There's tons of videos all over YouTube on how to solder. What I would do and what I did is I bought a little solder kit and I practiced on that. It'll make the world of difference, and it'll allow you to at least be competent in soldering when the time comes. Great, so all the non-solderers have left and all the solderers are here. Now, another disclaimer, if I didn't say it already, I'm going to repeat it here again. I am not an expert solderer, so if you're an expert solderer watching this, take it easy. I'm still learning, and these are definitely not going to be the best solder joints you've ever seen. But these are the basic principles which I followed when I went about soldering my plates. Now you got your ESC in place. What I did was I did the battery leads and the capacitor first. Soldering the battery lead was a little bit trickier than I had first thought. The pads weren't as big as I was hoping them to be, but nevertheless I managed to connect these quite easily. What I did do for the capacitor, and I'm not sure if this is the thing to do, but I bent the ends of them so they're a little bit shorter. What I wish I had done is inside the ESC there are these little sleeves, and I didn't realize that those sleeves were for the capacitor. I thought that they were heat shrink tubes, but they obviously weren't. That didn't make any sense. So I wish I put those on first. Those might come in your flight stack pack, so I would make sure that you put those on before soldering on the SucceX-D battery lead. You need to remember, very important, to put the capacitor on correctly. The capacitor is labeled with a negative side, and you need to make sure that that goes on the correct place. I zip tied the capacitor and the battery lead together, just so that in the event of a crash, they didn't pull each other apart and everything was in one place. I also zip tied the battery lead to the standoff so that it came up the side and not out the back. And I did this because I was nervous of there not being enough space when I eventually put on the antennas on the back of the drone. Now it comes time for you to solder on your motor wires onto your ESC, and it's an important time for you now to figure out whether you want your wires to come from the outside in or from the inside out. I chose to do them from the inside outwards because I kind of wanted to keep everything inside the quadcopter because I was kind of nervous of my first flight and damaging and breaking things. I also, in my head, didn't want to cut any of the wires because I was scared of cutting them too short or something like that. So I kept all the wires full length, and by going on the inside means I could use up that full length and have no extra slack in those wires. So I went around the entire board, adding a little tinning each of the pads before I soldered on the motors. Not the best soldering you've ever seen, but it did all work. I had a solder bridge at one point, which you can see right here, and I very quickly removed that. So be sure, like it just said, to look out for any solder bridges, because these will cause short circuits in your board, and those are not something we want to be dealing with. I routed my wires into the center of the frame and then down the middle and then onto the ESC pads. I used little zip ties to keep the cables together. I tried my best to keep the correct order. For the most part, I think I did. I think one of the motors was wired incorrectly, which later on, when I came onto the beta flight software, I think changed the direction. I'm not sure if that's what happens, but I think one of the motors I didn't wire in the correct order, but I don't think it makes any difference. So when you are ordering them up, it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever which order you wire the motors up, as long as each of the 3 sets of pads, so there'll be 6 on each side, there'll be 3 for the front, 3 for the backs, pairs of motors. You want to make sure that they're sorted up together so that your motors are working for each set of ESC. So this is a 4-in-1 ESC, which means it has 4 ESCs in one, and each ESC will have 3 pads for the given motor. Due to the length of the wires, one of the wires was not long enough to get to the solder pad, so I had to route it outside the frame, and I only had to do this on one of them, for one of them per motor on the back side of the frame. That's okay. That's something that I'll probably change in the future when I feel a little bit more comfortable with soldering and cutting wires, etc. Great. So you have, or I have now finished soldering all the motors to the ESC and the ESC to the battery lead, and then equally adding a capacitor to that battery lead. The soldering is now done, so you can breathe easy. This was the point where I kind of paused and stopped because I've been stressing about this for the weeks leading up to it. Once the soldering is done, you can kind of relax now. The hard work is all behind you. It's now time to install the flight controller. So you're going to get the flight controller out of its little packaging. You're going to figure out what goes where specifically. You're going to figure out which little cables you need, because you'll need 2 cables that come in this particular flight controllers pack. You'll need one that's going to link it to the ESC, and that will have a bigger to a smaller connector, and then you'll need the DJI connector, which goes from kind of the middle size to the biggest one that they have, and that will link the flight controller to the DJI Air unit, which we'll come to in a little bit. Again, you're going to have to install these little gummies. Like I said previously, I'd make sure that you have the maximum gap. In my particular build, I needed to make sure I had a big gap between the flight controller and the ESC, because that's where I had my motor wires coming through. So I needed to make sure I had a big enough gap. You want to figure out which side is up on your flight controller, and that will be the side that has all the gyros and everything shown on there. If you're not quite sure what that is, I would look at your flight controller's website, and they'll have everything labeled in there, and their marketing information. You can figure out which side needs to go up. The main reason why you want to put the gyros and all the smart stuff on top is to just keep it away from the electromagnetic interference, which usually comes with an ESC type board. A good way of telling is when you mount your flight controller, you want to make sure that the USB port, or in my case the USB-C port, is pointing outwards. Great, so you've now placed the flight controller on, you've got the gummies installed, you've clipped on the connector cable from the ESC to the flight controller. It's now officially time. It's now time to put on the DJI Air unit into your build. So grab the TPU mounts, screw those TPU mounts to the top plate, clip in your DJI Air unit. I put the little grated sides on the bottom, right above the flight stack plates. Now, what I realized at this point is that my flight stack screws that they sit on were touching my DJI Air unit. I couldn't really do anything about this at this point, so what I went and did is I figured out what size these screws were. In my case, these were M2 screws, and I ordered a new set of M2 screws that were shorter in length, and I'll list those down here below. They were shorter. I think I ordered 22 millimeter M2 screws, which made a world of difference, and you'll see later on in the build, or perhaps now actually, you'll see that the DJI Air unit no longer touches it. So you're going to connect the DJI Air unit to the top plate. The next thing to do is to put your FPV camera into its own mount, and it's important to figure out which direction is upwards, and there will be a little up arrow shown here on the DJI FPV unit, which will tell you which side needs to be up. Once you have that, you can then screw on your DJI FPV camera to its little mounts on the side. You first screw it onto the TPU 3D printed pieces, and then you clip on the carbon fiber. The carbon fiber has little slots on the top of the bottom and top plate, which they clip onto, and it holds the FPV camera in place. Once you have your DJI Air unit connected to its mount, which is connected to the top plate, you can now connect that to the FC with the cable that I mentioned earlier. This is the one that has the big DJI side, and then the smaller side that fits into the FC. You need to clip those two together and then kind of swindle the whole board on top of each other. You technically have everything now that you need in your drone. You have an air unit, you have the flight stack, you have all the motors, and you have everything wired up together. What you would typically now do is a smoke test to make sure that all of your wiring is correct and nothing is shorting itself. And there's two kind of steps to doing that. The first step is getting a multimeter, which I'd encourage you to get. You can get them for very cheap, something like 10 quid or $10, and you do a little multimeter test. And the way that you do that is you put it onto the continuity mode. You grab the red and black pointer things, you touch them onto the corresponding colors. At this point you should hear a short beep and then nothing. If you reverse that and you put the red onto the black and the black onto the red, you should hear a long beep, and then it should go away, and that's basically the capacitor absorbing some of that energy, and that means that you have a complete circuit and there's no continuity. If you do have continuity, you need to stop here, figure out what's wrong. You might have some solder bridges or something else that's incorrect. You do not want to plug in a battery now, because a battery could fry your system and damage something. So take the time, do this correctly. Right, so I said earlier that the most stressful thing was soldering. That was a complete lie, because at this point now, when you've completed everything, it's time to do the smoke stopper test. This is by far the most stressful thing you'll do all day. Some things that are super important to note before you do this. Obviously, you've just done the multimeter test. That's probably come up clear by this point, so that's great. You need to make sure that the DJI Air unit has the antennas clipped on, and when you clip them on, you'll hear a click. And once that click happens, you know everything's connected. Do not power on the air unit without the antennas connected. So it's time for the smoke stopper test. I was absolutely so let's cue the suspenseful music. Let's get ready to put the smoke stopper in. Let's be quiet. I'm so nervous. As you can see, everything worked. I didn't have any issues. This little smoke stopper connector, I'll also link down below. It was also part of my unboxing, so that's something that I'd recommend you definitely go get, because it'll be a necessity when you start building your drone. At this point, the next thing you need to do now is kind of piece everything together. And this drone comes with, it's got quite a long body, and at the back, where you would usually put like your VTX or something like that, your GPS unit, there's a big gap, and it's about, I don't know, 60 millimeters between the back of the FPV unit to where you need to clip on your antennas. I didn't realize that I needed to get extension to that, and that's a MMCX connector to an SMA, and that's a long lead that I needed to get. So at this point, I tried to piece everything together. It didn't work. I jumped on over to Amazon, ordered the parts that I needed. They came the very next day, which is now where you see me piecing all those parts together. I clipped them all in, screwed on the correct pigtail antennas, and then now we officially have a drone that's complete. So there you have it, folks. That is how you turn a box of parts into a cinematic FPV drone. There are some things, lessons I've learned along the way. One of them, do your research, but accept that even when you do your research, you're still going to make mistakes, because this is a hobby after all. The next one is enjoy the process. It's not going to be quick. In fact, it's probably going to be quite slow, and you need to be patient. You need to take the correct steps, and you need to listen to that little person on your shoulder that's telling you to slow down, or I'm not quite comfortable doing this, so maybe I should take a second. The journey is not over here. You've just built a drone, you've plugged it in, the wiring all works. The next thing you need to do is take that drone over to Betaflight and set up all the appropriate things on there. I currently won't be doing a Betaflight setup video, although I might look at doing that in the future. There's loads of videos online. There's a bunch of different software that you need to get it done. I did manage to do it. That took me a couple days in itself, but what I will share with you, which is something that'll be in the next video, is I managed to get this airborne. I did the maiden flight, or the maiden hover they call it, and then the maiden flight, and then I did my first flight with FPV goggles, which was kind of a weird experience. You end up just So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found this helpful. If anything, it was just a way for me to document this process. If you didn't find it helpful, also, let me know. If you found something that I did incorrectly or you want to correct me on, please feel free to do so. I'm all ears, and I'm very much open to learning. So I really, really appreciate you, and I appreciate the fact that you're watching this video. It means a lot. This is a hobby of mine. It's been a passion project. It's something I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to be on YouTube making videos and documenting something, a learning process, if anything. So have a fantastic night. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video. Leave a comment down below. Subscribe if you feel like it. And if not, you have a fantastic evening, and I'll see you around.